Thank you. Supervisor Kim?
Thank you. I did have a couple of questions for staff regarding traffic and mitigation plans. I think it's certainly been the biggest question and point of discussion in our neighborhood. While most people are excited about the arena and, of course, are very supportive of our undefeated Warriors team, the biggest question has always been, well, how can we as a city handle the influx of people that are going to come for our events and our concerts? So I believe this was a question for SFMTA. If you can walk us through a little bit in terms of how you've assessed some of the mitigation and then kind of the plan moving forward on how we can work on this. And then if you can also touch on how the arena is working to reduce vehicular traffic to the game, I think that would be great. And then finally, this came up a lot in public comment, is, how you're working with UCSF to ensure, very importantly, that our residents and UCSF patients are going to be able to receive the critical care that they may need in times of emergency.
Thank you. Peter Albert from MTA, and Supervisor, if I've left out one of the 3 points in your question, feel free to prompt me. Sure. I'll start with the overall transportation strategy, because I think that's the right approach. First of all, so much work has been done even before we required the environmental review to help us identify mitigation measures in what we call the Transportation Management Plan. In my extensive experience working on big projects in the city, to have that much work done up front to solve the problems before they're even identified as potential mitigation measures gives us a huge leg up, because we actually built this into the very DNA of the project. We still use the environmental review to make sure we're looking at the potential impacts, but the jump start here has been on some of the big issues that we really care about. Do we overflow the capacity of Muni because we're not buying enough extra streetcars to handle the crowds? Are we thinking about the nimbleness of the light rail system to make sure that when there's an event, people can still get to and from the Bayview without being blocked by streetcars? The very platform itself, is it big enough to handle what happens with the hospital and the Warriors Arena at the same time? Luckily, the answer is yes, 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 all three of those, because we were able to inform the very capital investments that needed to be made to help this project work better. We even thought about things that most people would never think about, like what happens when there's a Giants game and a Warriors game and two banks of electric operated light rail vehicles are waiting to queue up. Does that overtax our electrical supply system? We figured in case it does, and we got pretty close to that limit, we built into the capital investments of this project the extra power capacity, a substation that we actually would love to use even if there wasn't a Warriors Arena. So I'm starting with that, saying we thought about that plus the traffic mitigation measures, the implementation of parking control officers, learning very much from what we wish we had done more with the Giants ballpark. The bicycle networks, there's gaps in that networks that this project helps close. So the cycle track along Terry Francois Boulevard is part of this network and part of the project shape. So then we get into the mitigation measures and say, above and beyond that, looking at all the intersections identified, those south of Mariposa, those in South of Market, those in the vicinity of Mission Bay, where are the problems and what do we do to mitigate those? So you can see the transportation mitigation measures take this strong base and build into those strategies. What I would like to talk about, I think it's the next one, is how do we make sure that the people who need to get to the hospital when there's an event or dual events, make sure that their access is prioritized, that we're not compromising public safety. We hit that on so many levels. So let's say that we started with the extra transit and the traffic mitigation measures that we did as part of the project, and then what we analyzed in the environmental review. What we found is we still need to do more. So if I can switch to the overhead, I think I want to show you what we call the local hospital access plan and some of the basics of how that will function for accommodating the transportation needs of this area. Good. It's kind of a dense graphic, so let me walk you through what you see. You see, first of all, the basic streets in faint red are those that we analyze because we know their arterials are going to do heavy lifting. Those are also the streets that a lot of people will be taking to go to the parking facilities that serve the arena. It's important to point out that it's
Excuse me just a minute. Do you have any copies of that? Because my overhead is not working. I can't see it.
Yeah, I'm sure we could furnish that.
Thank you.
Perhaps you can email this to the board so we can pull it up on our computers.
And what I'll... oh, thank you. All right, so
It's actually also important for the public to see it too, so I just want to make sure we
Sure.
have,
Yeah, what I
we're
don't
able
want to do
to
is I don't want
follow.
to use, thank you, I don't want to use the graphic while that's being copied because then that means that no one's looking at it. So I was going to go, here's like a really important part of our analysis that I was going to get to that doesn't require a monitor. It's making sure we're using the state-of-the-art transportation strategy when you get a hospital near an event center. We thought that this might not be the first time that ever happened. We did a good study. We found 12 American cities that had major hospitals within a half mile and much closer, typically, than what we see here. Some of the cities that are, thank you. Some of the cities that we looked at were Los Angeles, Boston, Chicago, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Seattle, Miami. In Los Angeles, it's not just one entertainment center. There's three major ones, Staples. There's the sports venues. There's two large entertainment venues, all within a block of the only 24/7 trauma center in all of the city of Los Angeles. We looked at Pittsburgh, where they have two hospitals right next to both. If you know Pittsburgh, they got the baseball stadium right by the football stadium. We looked in New Orleans, where they have two hospitals, two health centers right near Super Bowl Drive. We look at Minneapolis, which is kind of amazing because Minneapolis is building a brand new football stadium directly kitty corner from a major hospital. What we found is that none of those have anything like a local hospital access plan. So we got to kind of invent how this should be done. Am I good now with the graphic that you have? Good. So let's go back to this one. What we did was we looked at the street networks that are needed to get people to and from the Warriors Arena. Again, I want to emphasize that the parking provision in the Warriors is not an accidental feature. It's defined to minimize the amount of traffic that's coming right to the heart of this area. So we use intercept parking. We use the facilities that are around their Mission Bay facilities. We have two other parking facilities that are going to be part of this agreement. But still, people are still going to try and come close to the center of the arena. We know that.
I can't see.
We also want to make sure that people who arrive into critical medical shifts about the same time an event might be happening at the arena can use the streets that bring them to the front door of UCSF. So this graphic shows the streets in close partnership with UCSF that they agreed would help make sure nurses could get to and from where they're from the outer area to the hospital. We identify those streets in the blue network. They include 4th. They include Nelson Rising. They include portions of Owens right by Mariposa. We also identified streets working closely with Dogpatch, Potrero Hill, and South Beach and Mission Bay, where they would like to make sure if they're just trying to get north and south and they don't want to get caught up in this, is there an arterial that's useful for them that doesn't compromise access to the Warriors Arena? And Owens ends up being that kind of street. It works well for north-south access, but it isn't a street that helps people coming around to get to the front door. Now, coloring streets on a map is one thing. Making sure we staff every time there's a certain event, and we have a variety of events that we're accommodating here, we staff those intersections to help people safely get to where they need to go while directing Warriors patrons to the parking facilities has been a huge success. Supervisor, you know in your neighborhood how much success we had with the pilots on the PCOs partnering with the police. Great model. That taught us a lot. So what we have here are multicolored stars because there's layers of when we need them. The most stars are in the most extensive situation where there's a Giants game and the Warriors at the same time. But we know that not every event is a big number, so we want to be smart, fiscally prudent, and making sure we're not overextending our budget by treating every day as if it's a 19,500-foot event. The beauty of this is that we put the stars where the analysis showed us where there might be problems. What we have, though, is flexibility and revenue, and that makes the difference. If the revenue's coming in, and my colleagues can talk about, define how we support the transportation plans we need, and we work closely with cost estimates of a PCO, of transit service, of maintenance, and we have that red star right there by the Warriors Arena that's the Transportation Management Center. We can deploy these PCOs where they need to be. We got a lot of good input from folks in Dogpatch and Potrero Hill about how they would like to see extra PCO help south of Mariposa. And you see some stars doubling up because we have a Giants PCO, parking control officer, and a Warriors PCO. We have the ability to make sure that we can put more of them down there if that's where attention is needed. And then finally, that cost of all of those stars on that map, of all of those human beings that are intelligently unblocking the box and managing traffic, is not the complete cost that we would be able to recoup through the revenue. So later in this conversation, thank you, later in the conversation, you're going to be able to talk more about this lockbox model, which helps make sure that the revenues coming in go to exactly these kinds of transportation strategies. Now, one thing I didn't cover, which is probably like the starting point, but I did it the way I did it because I think you want to get to the nuts and bolts, is the broader functionality of this part of town. We heard some criticism about the transit-only lanes on the 16th Street corridor that serve the 22 Fillmore. It's actually going to make the 22 more reliable and higher capacity and more frequent. So for transit-only events, this is like the dream come true. The T-Third also has transit-only right-of-ways. These are already used by emergency vehicles. There's a public health center right there on 3rd Street that allows ambulances and fire engines to get to and out. The two red streets that you see on this map, 16th and 3rd, intersect at exactly the intersections where there's the Warriors Arena and the hospital. Now, those stars are humans that are trained to help emergency cases get onto those emergency right-of-ways if they need to. You don't just need a flashing light of an ambulance to help someone who has an emergency situation get bypassed, waved by the PCOs who can recognize that situation a good half mile out and bring them to the front door. There's no other hospital in San Francisco I know that has transit-only right-of-ways that double as emergency vehicle access lanes in north, south, and east-west directions. So this basic landscape, this use of transit right-of-ways to help with emergency, the nimbleness of putting PCOs where they need to be and moving them around where they actually need to be when the Transportation Management Center is in operation, the experience of what's been happening in the rest of the country when these juxtapositions happen, and then the other metrics that go into the local hospital access plan that we work so closely with UCSF, that we would monitor how long it takes to use these Blue Street networks to get to the front door. We would do this religiously and carefully, and when they trip a certain threshold, we have to do much more. It's very much built into the plan. That is a mitigation measure. That's what we are obligated to do. But that helps everybody. A nurse who knows it takes this much extra time to get there will be supported by the PCOs and these transit networks and these exclusive travel lanes. If monitoring shows we're coming up against the brink, we don't wait for it to happen. We use that Transportation Management Center to deploy the extra PCOs where we need them to go. If over the course of the year we see a problem rising because the monitor information is data rich, we're able to make sure we step up the plan. So I'm only scratching the surface of how complex this local hospital access plan is, but I could not be at this point describing it with such confidence if it didn't work in partnership not only with UCSF, but with the Mission Bay businesses and residents who also benefit from this strategy. So, not taking up any more time, unless there's more questions, I'd be happy to.
Mr. Albert, I just have one follow-up question. I know that Supervisor Cohen has some questions as well, as she represents the district neighboring this arena. You had talked a bit about the local access roads, which will be cleared just for vehicles going towards the hospital. And I know this came up when we had met, but I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how the enforcement for that would happen and also what the signage would look like. Because the original signage that I saw, I mean, I wouldn't understand that that meant that I couldn't drive through those roads unless I was going, unless I was not going to the arena.
Thank you. Yes, there's sort of a soft and a hard control that happens. The soft control is to make sure that we're not creating queues of people that have to be badge checked, identification checked before they can pass into what we call the hard controls. So at some of the intersections, such as at the intersection of 7th and Mission Bay Boulevard, just west of the freeway, or even at the traffic circle there, those are PCOs that are helping unblock the box, keeping traffic flowing, but they're not requiring checks. The checks would be required when you're on those blue streets getting closer to the hospital and you really don't have business there looking around to find an on-street parking space or it's not going to be there. We don't want you there. We want the nurses to be able to get there. That's where the badging works. The agreement with UCSF that we're so excited about is that they're going to make sure that the employees know when these scheduled events happen. They'll have their badges. They'll have this understanding. And then here's some great feedback. The people in the life sciences community around there already know our PCOs by name. They have a human relationship with people like Monica Georgopoulos, who is singled out as someone who's been resourceful and really helpful. These are people who will know what to do, they'll know how to be nimble about these situations, and they'll report on a regular basis. So when we get the system worked out with the shift regulars and they know the scheduling, we imagine that this is going to be a clockwork operation.
So that's great in terms of ensuring that hospital workers are going to be able to get in and out through the neighborhood, but we also have a lot of residents that will want to use the local access road. And also when there are arena attendees that do use these roads, how are you going to enforce against that type of behavior?
So the blue streets identify areas where there aren't residents for that reason. Now, those, especially Nelson Rising and 4th, become streets that are in the core of what's the hospital campus. But the soft closures, to keep up with the periphery, those are where people can go through. They're not necessarily being told you have to prove you live here. What they're saying is going to the arena, this is where to go. Going into Berry Street,
so
going
there'll
to
be
these communities
people out on the
right.
street saying those
That's
things.
Right. And permanent signs year-round that help direct that so that people can follow the notions without a human necessarily having to direct them.
Right, but the signs that I was shown, I wouldn't have understood them. Local access road only doesn't mean anything to me. So if I was going to the arena, even as a SOMA resident, I wouldn't have known that meant I couldn't drive through there to get to the arena, because the arena is in the city locally. So is there a way that we can better...
This is what I'm going to say, absolutely. Because the arena opens in 2018, and we can work on clarity and signs, and we can actually test things. We're actually starting to do some of the strategy testing, the use of transit right-of-ways for emergency vehicle access. If we want to get the language right so that it's immediately intuitive and understandable, it could even be that we could use signs now to help sort out access to the hospital even without the arena. This is the time now, with this kind of feedback, to make sure we got it right. I'd be happy to share with you prototypes that you think help get at that need for clarity and legibility.
I think that's the most important thing if you're going to put signage up and say that it's going to have some level of direction, is that it actually makes sense. Right. And if it doesn't make sense to a city supervisor, I just don't see how it's going to make sense to an arena attendee. And I provided this feedback months ago, so I was hoping that we would have some iterations by now and not say we'll deal with that after the vote.
Well, be assured, if it is about legibility and signs, we work with those challenges.
Not legibility, it's understanding what the sign
is saying. But we do have problems with legibility. People have, well, there's a lot of issues like, right. Okay, so, yes.
Thank you.
So earlier this year and late last year, I think it might have been even late last year, there was an ongoing discussion about the Mission Bay Loop. And as you know, I'm just looking to make sure I'm not overlooking anyone. The Mission Bay Loop has been a pretty contentious proposal that has come from MTA. And I was wondering if you considered the Mission Bay Loop, or how does the Mission Bay Loop, which is, for the folks in the audience, MTA has proposed the T-line to come down to a certain point on 3rd Street and then loop around to go back into the system to relieve pressure in other areas of the city. How does the Mission Bay Loop complement, or even, I assume it complements, or maybe it doesn't, with the T-line and some of the proposals that we're dealing with now? Because at that time at Mission Bay Loop, we weren't even thinking about a stadium, or an arena being built. So.
Sure. Thank you. Peter Alba again from MTA. So while it might be tricky to talk about some aspects of the loop, because I need to be clear, it's under injunction right now, we assumed the operation of the Mission Bay Loop to complement the Central Subway. So what that meant was we created an extra intensity of light rail service between the Mission Bay Loop, which is at 3rd and between 18th and 19th, and then Chinatown. So you would get 2 layers of T3rd service. T3rd service from Chinatown all the way to the Bayview, and then T3rd service short line, which goes to the Mission Bay Loop. Of course, the arena's position north of that helped them benefit from the full extra service that's there. The assumptions also included the 2-car operation of the T, so if there are questions or concerns about the capacity for light rail, this actually helps double the capacity of every service and increase the frequency. So the Mission Bay Loop's design is to give us nimbleness and extra service coverage on a corridor where we expect there to be more demand.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to kind of pivot back to, I think, Mr. Albert, this is for you. Now, you know, we've had many conversations about switchbacks.
Yep. And
you already know how I feel about them. And Supervisor Tang also. And for the members that are here from the public, I hate switchbacks. Switchbacks have the T-line going down southbound into the city, and then they switch back into the other parts to switch back to go into the other part of the other parts of the city to relieve traffic, thus rendering the people that are on the T-line without transportation to get home. So I want to ensure that we are not exacerbating the T-lines, because when I read the plan and the analysis, it looks like it will actually help alleviate switchback problems.
So thank you. I do want to point out I'm both an N-Judah writer and a T-third writer, so I've experienced the downside of that phenomenon. But I mean, it wasn't just my own personal interest in making sure it never happens to me again. We hear all the time about that challenge. The problem is if we don't provide the extra capacity of the extra fleet, what happens is we have to make a hard decision to pull a streetcar that otherwise wants to go to the end of the line, turn it around. So we built that into how our service plan should work. That's why we looked at a crowding factor and figured out how many, because these are expensive, these streetcars, and we knew if we were going to have a partnership, we wanted to make sure we could justify why we wanted them to be covered in the revenues. We came up with 4 full streetcar sets. That helps us offset the need to take any other trains out of service on even the biggest event day, because those 4 cars would not be possible except for the agreement we have with the provision of this event center. That means then the T-thirds that need to go all the way down to the Bayview don't have to turn around because we're having a big crowd over there. That's why we augmented our fleet with those 4 cars.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the north-south transportation with the T line. Now let's talk about the east-west transportation from the 16th and Mission BART station. How have we enhanced the coaches that are traveling on 16th and 17th?
So thank you. If I could have the overhead. I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask because I think it's a great starting point. When you're looking at the problems that are in the area right now, you know what you know. You know what's out there. What we wanted to make sure, looking at 2018, is to understand the conditions today, including the difficulty of going east-west, what will happen between now and, say, 2018, 2019, what investments are in place, and then what more do we need to do to handle the event center. East-west traffic is a big challenge. The graphic right now shows that we took a snapshot of what's happening by 2020. That includes that 22 Fillmore that runs on 16th Street east-west. It also includes the connections to multiple BART stations, because Central Subway allows us to get to Powell Street. The existing N-Judah service goes to Embarcadero. This 16th Street corridor helps us get to 16th Street. So unlike AT&T Park, where there's a critical mass of people around the Embarcadero, we spread that burden on 3 different BART stations and help them dissipate. However, the analysis said we needed to do more. So this next graphic I'm going to put on there shows what more could look like. Building onto the backbone of all this infrastructure, we're going to run extra muni buses and extra muni trains. They're much like the shuttles we do for an AT&T Park. So we know we need to run more T-thirds from the Mission Bay Loop into Chinatown, because that's going to help people get to Powell Street BART. And it gets there pretty quickly because of the subway. We keep that N-Judah line on the Embarcadero and extend it down into the Arena Center on a post-game event so people can get back via the waterfront. And we augment not only the 22 Fillmore that runs on 16th Street, we take advantage of the new BRT line on Van Ness, which goes north-south in the western part of the city, and we plug a line from that BRT all the way in from the marina through the Van Ness metro station, through South of Market, into the Mission, along the Mission east-west in there. We're reaching so many different access points from people all over the city that you could probably make this trip to the arena with no transfer, or at least one, to a high-capacity, high-frequency system.
Now, are people going to be able to use this transportation system when there are no games being played? So
you identified some of the, we talked about what we need to do for an event center. To make that happen, we had to build capital facilities. Those capital facilities, including those extra streetcars, help us run even if there's no event. The flexibility of the pocket track, the expanded platform is something we wish we could have done from the beginning, and we're doing it now. The extra streetcars can be used anywhere in the city we need that extra capacity. But we are not jump-starting stuff that's already lined up to happen. We're taking advantage of the investments we built, and you're using them to the maximum efficiency.
Okay, fair enough. One of the things that really piqued my interest and answered my question already was how well thought out the PCO answer is into traffic. So we've talked about congestion or potential congestion on public transportation, but there's a real reality of the folks that live in the neighborhood. I live in Potrero Hill. The place is already congested as it is right now with cars on the street and bicyclists. So it is comforting to hear that there will be enforcement. Now, this PCO enforcement, again, is this something that's going to be standard, a new standard of living, or is this something that's going to be on game days or when there are an event at the arena?
So thank you. We designed the PCO plan for the events, but not just game days. It's something that would happen even if there's a small event. I think you might have seen the graphic that shows there's a variety of events that trigger different responses.
Right. What are those triggers?
I'll show you here.
Do you think this is something that we could also implement on an everyday, everyday purpose, an everyday?
The Transportation Management Center is in operation every day. What it does is it creates a new gravity of transportation management in the heart of Mission Bay. There isn't one now. It's going to have state-of-the-art cameras, safety mechanisms. We can see what's happening at intersections. It allows our whole staff, not just our parking control officers, but our transit operators, a base. And so what they need to know is this graphic here shows the variety of events and the sizes that are happening. Building this into our schedule makes sure that we can staff up for the events we know that are going to happen and staff down when we need to be more lean. And so I think that's an important part of this. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Would this require us to do any hiring, or is this a job generator? Are we talking about an opportunity for local hire, or do you already have the staff on?
We don't already have the staff. It is an opportunity to hire. The challenge to we know what we need. Now we have to identify the revenues to bring them in. And that's where this lockbox conversation is so essential. The revenues that are only here because of the event center and dedicated to this local source help us make sure these very needs that we have identified have actual human beings showing up to duty.
Got it. Okay. I think we might have exhausted my list of questions.
Supervisor Avalos.
Thank you. I just have, it's probably for Mr. Albert, I have a question. We've heard a lot about the ways we've studied this project and different ways that we can mitigate the impact. What I'm really interested in hearing is, what is the quantifiable impact? What's the difference we're going to see, let's say, to our muni lines, quantifiably? Are we actually going to see, based on what we're able to apply with our mitigation measures, a benefit, or even despite our mitigation measures, are we going to see delays? What have we been able to measure with that, so we get down into the weeds?
Thank you, to the President. So when we talk about muni lines, one of the most important mitigation thresholds is overcrowding. So there's flow of traffic, which we talk about level of service A, B, C, D, E, and F. But in Muni, it's beyond that, because that does impact the operations of transit. Here we have the benefit of these transit protected right-of-ways where that's not really as much an issue, but what would be an issue is undersupplying the transit capacity. So we have a threshold at MTA that says above this, you're creating a significant impact because the trains are too crowded for people to even get on. That analysis is the threshold. I could lean on my colleagues at City Planning to identify the threshold. We've provided that to them. Well, our responsibility at MTA was to make sure where we needed more capacity, we had those extra buses, we had those extra streetcars, or we needed to actually procure more fleet.
So my question is, are we getting over capacity? Are we getting to that threshold? And how often in your measurements? And then I'm also interested not just in the capacity of the cars themselves, but also of our lines to be able to move people in terms of frequency and preventing delays. Sure.
So yes, we're getting close to the threshold, but our mitigation measures helped us stay below what that threshold was. I'm sorry, the second part of your question?
Second part is based on, are we looking at delays? Because despite our mitigation measures, are there delays? How would that affect our headways for muni lines? And which, if you could do it line by line. Right. I think we're just talking about the 22 and the. Yeah. And I'm concerned also about not just the people who are getting to the arena, but the people who are getting past the arena from one end to the other. Because on the T line to get to downtown, you're actually going past it. What's the experience going to be based on what your measurements have been?
So we started with an analysis of where we had capacity still to fill up these trains and make sure we had enough of them running to keep our headways. The advantage we had is when the biggest events are happening, tend to be in the post, the event centers. The events would start at 7 or 7:30, sometimes even 8 o'clock at night. So we missed the peak of the peak. But better than that, though, is the reverse commute potential. Except for the T, where you have a lot of people coming from downtown through there, you've got a lot of trains that are coming into downtown, dropping people, or they're coming in fairly empty and taking commuters home or out to the outlying areas. So if you're coming in from the north, the west, or the south part of the city, on BART, on Muni, on Caltrain, you've actually got more capacity, especially at these later hours. The fleet itself could have been a challenge, but after about 6:30, and before the event really kicks in, we start to retire our fleet because the biggest numbers are already done their heaviest lifting. So we are especially aware of when we can keep some vehicles in operation beyond that 6:30 threshold to get us into 7:15, if an event's at 7:30, even later if it's at 8. At 10 o'clock at night, there isn't a problem. We have a whole bunch of fleet, buses and trains, that we can just pull right back out of the yard, and we do that already. We don't have the problems with congestion in the corridors, provided that the mitigation measures we identified allow that flow. But again, we had a huge head start because two of the critical transit arterials are absolutely protected from traffic congestion, 16th and 3rd Street.
They're absolutely protected from traffic.
Right. Those are transit-only ways. The only other vehicles that can be on them are emergency vehicles.
What is the quantifiable difference? And if you're able to, I mean, you talked about what ways that you can mitigate, changes, you can mitigate impacts, but what have you been able to see in terms of quantifiable differences in headways? And you say you got close to capacity on vehicles. I guess that's close to the answer to my question, but on really on headways, are we seeing an improvement based on, are we seeing a some delays based on what we're going to see in terms of people coming to the arena? Right,
and so again, I'll hand it to Adam Vanderwater. I just want to point out why we do this sort of 1-2 combo with me and Adam. We gave him the data. He plugged it into the thresholds that matter to the EIR. He bounced back what the results were, and that helped us make sure that if we gave him our most rigid standards about overcrowding or missing headways, he helped us translate that with the help of the planning department into performance. So, Adam.
Thank you, Peter. I have the luxury of focusing on one and not many projects at the same time. The reason behind the Mission Bay Transportation Improvement Fund, item 66 on your agenda today, is really to put the funds aside in a controller's reserve so that we can fund all of the costs of all of this transit service without impacting any parts of the service. We absolutely do not want to cannibalize service from elsewhere in the city. We recognize that people take transit to get to school, to daycare, to work, to run their errands, and we cannot afford to pull that service on a regular basis away from there, as we occasionally do for one-off large events in San Francisco.
Don't we already have some level of cannibalization with Giants games? I have the experience of going to Giants games on Muni, and I do see like there's limited service elsewhere. Maybe it's not entirely limited, but it's limited. I also have had the experience of going on, coming back from games, and I go south. I don't go north or west to the western part of San Francisco, and I know it's very much easier to catch a train going north and west versus south, and I've actually experienced switchbacks even coming back from Giants games. So we've learned some things from that experience, and that's actually going to improve the transit opportunities for people. There's plenty of people who actually go past the games on our transit systems who don't go to the games as well, and are very inconvenienced, even right now, by the games.
So through the President again, yes. We do have, there's two problems that happen with the Giants game the way it is now. We didn't build in the track flexibility that allows trains to get around them so easily. So if you're trying to catch Caltrain, you're stuck sometimes behind a queue of streetcars that are just unloading passengers. So that's part of the reasons why the crossover tracks and that platform reconfiguration, something that really would help us in the Warriors, would have been lovely at the Giants. The other factor, those 4 light rail vehicles that came into this were defined especially to make sure that the crowds that we're absorbing, remember that the Warriors Arena is only at the highest, was it 19,000 or 18,500? Whereas the Giants fill up a 42,000 seat stadium. So we have a smaller number to work with, and yet we're uniquely in this project providing extra streetcars to accommodate that smaller number.